The nurse was humiliated for taking too long to attend a millionaire, but the hospital director froze when he saw the childhood photo of his lost daughter, the same one he took on her 7th birthday before she disappeared many years ago. The harsh fluorescent lights of St. Raphael Medical Center cast an unforgiving glow over the emergency room as Emily Carter pressed her stethoscope against 7-year-old Marcus Thompson's chest. The boy's lips had turned a terrifying shade of blue, and his small body lay motionless on the gurney. Emily's hands moved with practiced precision, her 29 years melting away as she became the focused, determined nurse who had saved countless lives in this very room. "Come on, sweetheart," she whispered. Beginning chest compressions. The monitor's flat line seemed to mock her efforts, but Emily had learned long ago never to give up on a child. Growing up in St. Catherine's Orphanage had taught her that every life was precious, that every soul deserved someone to fight for them. The automatic doors burst open with a violent whoosh, and Richard Sullivan stormed into the ER like a man possessed. At 35, the millionaire entrepreneur was used to getting his way immediately, especially when it came to his health. His perfectly tailored Armani suit and gold Rolex screamed wealth and entitlement, a stark contrast to the modest scrubs Emily wore as she fought to bring Marcus back from the brink. "Where the hell is someone who can help me?" Richard's voice boomed across the emergency room, causing several patients to look up in alarm. "I've got a migraine that's killing me, and I need to see a doctor right now." Emily didn't even glance up from Marcus. She was administering rescue breaths now, her entire world focused on the child beneath her hands. "Sir, please take a seat in the waiting area. We'll get to you as soon as what?" Richard's face flushed red with fury. "Do you have any idea who I am? I donate millions to this hospital every year. My time is worth more than whatever you're wasting it on over there." The cruelty of his words hit Emily like a physical blow, but she couldn't afford to be distracted. Marcus's heart had started beating again, weak but steady. She continued her work, tears of relief mixing with the sweat on her brow. "That whatever is a 7-year-old boy whose life I just saved," Emily said quietly, her voice trembling with exhaustion and emotion. "So yes, Mr. Sullivan, I think his life is worth your time." Richard's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Don't you dare lecture me, you little nobody. I could have you fired with one phone call. People like you should know their place." Other patients in the waiting room began pulling out their phones. Sensing drama, someone started recording as Richard continued his tirade, his words becoming more vicious by the minute. He attacked everything about Emily, her humble background, her obvious incompetence, her pathetic attempt to play hero. The humiliation was devastating, made worse by the growing crowd of onlookers who seemed to delight in the spectacle. Emily's hands shook as she completed Marcus's stabilization. The little boy's eyes fluttered open, and she managed a watery smile. "Hey there, brave guy. You're going to be just fine." It was at that moment that Dr. Alexander Hayes arrived. At 58, Alexander commanded respect without even trying. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled despite the early morning hour, and his presence seemed to fill the entire emergency room. He'd been the hospital's chief of surgery for over a decade, known for his brilliant surgical skills and unwavering dedication to his patients. What most people didn't know was that Alexander had been living with a broken heart for 22 years, ever since the day his 7-year-old daughter Ava had vanished without a trace. "What's going on here?" Alexander's voice cut through the chaos like a scalpel. His piercing blue eyes took in the scene, Richard's flushed face, Emily's tears, the crowd of recording phones, and little Marcus breathing peacefully on the gurney. Richard immediately switched tactics, putting on his most charming smile. "Dr. Hayes, thank God you're here. This nurse has been completely unprofessional, making me wait while well, I'm sure she means well, but I really need medical attention for this migraine." Alexander's gaze moved to Emily, who was trying to compose herself while preparing Marcus for transport to pediatrics. Something about her dedication reminded him painfully of someone he'd lost long ago, someone who had loved children with the same fierce protectiveness Emily was showing now. "Miss Carter has just saved a child's life," Alexander said calmly. "I'd hardly call that unprofessional." Emily looked up in surprise. In all her 3 years at St. Raphael, Dr. Hayes had rarely spoken directly to her, though she'd always admired his reputation and skill. She fumbled with her equipment, suddenly self-conscious under his steady gaze. Of course, Richard backpedaled quickly. I didn't mean to imply. It's just this headache is really... As Richard continued his excuses, Emily bent down to retrieve her stethoscope from the floor. In her emotional state and exhaustion from the resuscitation, she moved too quickly and lost her balance. Her worn canvas bag slipped from her shoulder, hitting the ground with a soft thud and spilling its contents across the sterile hospital floor. A tube of lip balm rolled toward Richard's expensive shoes. Her hospital ID badge skittered under a nearby chair. Her worn wallet fell open, revealing exactly $17 and a picture of her with the other orphanage children from years ago. And then, sliding across the polished floor like a message from the past, came the photograph that had been Emily's most treasured possession for as long as she could remember. Alexander bent down automatically to help gather her belongings, his physician's instincts kicking in to assist someone in distress. But as his fingers closed around the yellowed, faded photograph, his entire world stopped spinning. The image was burned into his memory, a little girl with bright eyes and a radiant smile, wearing a pink birthday dress, standing next to nothing, where there should have been a man, where there had been a man in the identical photo that sat on Alexander's office desk. There was only a carefully torn edge, as if someone had deliberately removed half of the picture. Alexander's hands began to tremble. His breath caught in his throat. The photograph in Emily's bag was identical to the one he'd treasured for 22 years, except for one crucial detail. In his version, he stood next to his daughter Ava on her 7th birthday, 3 days before she disappeared forever. In Emily's version, his image had been torn away, leaving only the ghost of his presence and the perfect, innocent smile of a child who looked exactly like the nurse standing before him. "Sir, are you all right?" Emily's concerned voice seemed to come from very far away. Alexander forced himself to breathe, to think, to function. With tremendous effort, he placed the photograph gently back into Emily's hands, careful not to let their fingers touch for fear that the contact might shatter what remained of his composure. "I'm fine," he managed, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "Just tired?" Emily tucked the photo safely back into her bag, unaware that the man standing before her had just experienced the shock of his lifetime. To her, it was just another difficult day in a series of difficult days. To Alexander, it was the moment when 22 years of searching, hoping, and grieving suddenly crystallized into one impossible possibility. "Thank you for helping me, Dr. Hayes," Emily said softly. "And thank you for standing up for me. It means more than you know." Alexander nodded. Not trusting himself to speak, Richard continued complaining in the background, but the sound had become white noise. All Alexander could think about was the photograph, the torn edge where his own face should have been, and the young woman whose eyes held the same gentle strength he remembered in his lost daughter. As Emily wheeled Marcus toward the pediatric unit, Alexander watched her go with new eyes. 22 years of searching had led him through false hopes, dead ends, and heartbreak that had nearly destroyed him. He'd built walls around his heart, thrown himself into his career, and tried to accept that Ava was gone forever. But now, holding on to the memory of that photograph, Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced in over 2 decades. Hope. Dangerous. Terrifying. Beautiful hope that maybe, just maybe, his little girl had found her way home at last. Alexander's hands trembled as he closed his office door behind him. The photograph burned into his memory like a brand. 22 years of carefully constructed composure crumbled as he sank into his leather chair, staring at the identical picture on his desk. The last happy moment he'd shared with his daughter before their world shattered forever. March 15th, 2002. Ava's 7th birthday. The memory crashed over him like a tidal wave. Margaret had been gone for 8 months by then, killed in a car accident that had left Alexander drowning in grief, and 7-year-old Ava asking why Mommy wouldn't come home. He'd tried so hard to be both parents, to fill the void left by his beloved wife's death, but the weight of loss had been crushing. That's when Catherine stepped in. Margaret's younger sister had always been beautiful, manipulative, and dangerously obsessed with Alexander. Even during his courtship with Margaret, Catherine had made her feelings known through lingering touches, meaningful glances, and comments that walked the line between sisterly concern and something far more inappropriate. "You can't raise Ava alone," "Alexander," Catherine had said just days after the funeral, her manicured hand resting possessively on his arm, "you're destroyed by grief. Let me help. Let me take care of both of you." Alexander had been too broken to see the calculation behind her kindness. When Catherine convinced their mother that Alexander was unstable and needed time to heal, when she suggested that Ava should stay with family temporarily, it had seemed like mercy. He'd signed the temporary guardianship papers, believing he was doing what was best for his daughter. He'd been such a fool. Catherine had moved into their house immediately, redecorating Margaret's spaces, throwing away photos, slowly erasing his wife's presence while positioning herself as the new woman of the household. She'd been patient, playing the role of devoted sister-in-law while systematically isolating Alexander from Ava. "Daddy's very sick right now, sweetheart," he'd overheard Catherine telling Ava one evening. "He needs quiet time to get better. Why don't you stay with Aunt Catherine tonight?" One night became two became a week stretched into a month of carefully orchestrated separation. But Alexander had been fighting his way back from the darkness, attending therapy, taking medication, slowly reclaiming his life and his role as Ava's father. He'd been planning to reclaim custody, to bring his daughter home where she belonged. That's when Catherine made her move. March 18th, 2002, Lincoln Park, 3 days after Ava's birthday party, 3 days after that last perfect photograph, Catherine had volunteered to take Ava to the park. Such a normal, innocent outing. Aunt Catherine had been taking Ava places for months. There was no reason to suspect anything, except Catherine had been planning this moment for weeks. The 2 men she'd hired were professionals, criminals who specialized in making people disappear for the right price. Catherine had paid them handsomely, not just for the kidnapping, but for their absolute silence. The plan was simple. Take Ava during the park visit, make it look like a stranger abduction, then eliminate the child permanently once the heat died down. With Ava gone, Alexander would inherit everything Margaret had left behind, including a substantial trust fund that would have gone to their daughter. More importantly, Alexander would be completely broken, dependent on Catherine for emotional support, grateful for her unwavering loyalty during his darkest hour. It should have worked perfectly, but the kidnappers had panicked when the story made national news. Missing 7-year-old girls generated too much attention, too much police involvement, too many questions. Instead of following Catherine's instructions, they'd driven Ava to a city 300 miles away and abandoned her near a Catholic church, hoping to distance themselves from the crime. The head trauma from being thrown from their moving vehicle had caused severe memory loss. When the nuns found Ava, she couldn't remember her name, her address, or her family, with no missing child reports filed in that jurisdiction. She'd been placed in the local orphanage system as Jane Doe, eventually becoming Emily Carter. When the nuns chose a name for the girl who couldn't remember her own, Catherine had played her role perfectly, the grieving aunt, supporting her devastated brother-in-law through the disappearance of his only child. She'd been by Alexander's side during every police interview, every false lead, every crushing disappointment. She'd held him when he cried, brought him food when he forgot to eat, and slowly, methodically, positioned herself as the only constant in his shattered life. For 22 years, she'd sabotaged every investigation. When private detectives got too close to the truth, evidence would mysteriously disappear. When witnesses came forward, they'd suddenly change their stories or vanish entirely. Catherine had used her considerable charm and Alexander's wealth to ensure that Ava Hayes remained a ghost. Meanwhile, she'd played the perfect supporting role in Alexander's life, never pushing too hard for romance, but always there, always available, always reminding him that she was the only one who truly understood his pain. She'd watched him throw himself into his career, becoming one of Chicago's most respected surgeons while slowly dying inside. Now, sitting in his office with the memory of Emily Carter's photograph searing through his mind, Alexander forced himself to think clearly. The coincidences were too significant to ignore. Emily's age matched perfectly with what Ava's would be now. She'd been found abandoned at a Catholic orphanage in the exact time frame of Ava's disappearance, and there was something else, something that had nagged at him during their brief interaction. The small scar above Emily's left eyebrow. Ava had fallen from her bike 2 weeks before her 7th birthday, requiring 3 stitches in that exact spot. Alexander had been the one to hold her hand while the emergency room doctor cleaned and sutured the wound, promising his brave little girl that the scar would make her look like a warrior princess. His computer screen illuminated as he began typing, accessing the hospital's personnel database. Emily Carter's employment file revealed frustratingly little. Hired 3 years ago, excellent performance reviews, home address in a modest neighborhood, next of kin listed as none. But there were medical records from her pre-employment physical date of birth, March 12, 1995, 3 days before Ava's birthday, close enough for a traumatized child who couldn't remember her real age, height, weight, blood type. Everything matched the daughter he'd lost, but it was the notation about a small facial scar, consistent with childhood injury, that made Alexander's heart stop completely. 22 years of searching, 22 years of false hopes and crushing disappointments, 22 years of Catherine's comforting presence, her gentle sabotage disguised as loving support. Could it really be possible that his daughter had been working in his own hospital for 3 years? That he'd walked past her countless times without recognizing the little girl who used to fall asleep in his arms while he read her bedtime stories? Alexander pulled out his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized years ago. James Morrison, the private investigator who'd never stopped looking for Ava, even after Alexander could no longer afford to pay him. "James, it's Alexander Hayes. I need you to run a complete background check on someone. Her name is Emily Carter. And I think she might be my daughter." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several heartbeats before James spoke. "Alex, you know I'd do anything for you, but we've been down this road before. Are you sure you want to put yourself through this again?" Alexander stared at the photograph on his desk, his hand resting protectively on 7-year-old Ava's shoulder, both of them grinning at the camera with identical smiles. Then he thought of Emily Carter's face, the way she'd fought so fiercely for little Marcus, the gentle strength in her eyes that reminded him so achingly of his lost daughter. This time is different. "James, this time I'm absolutely certain." As Alexander hung up the phone, he had no idea that 3 floors below, Emily Carter was lying in her narrow apartment bed, struggling with dreams that felt more like memories. In her sleep, she saw a man with kind eyes and gentle hands, heard a voice calling her, "My little star," and felt an inexplicable sense of home that she'd never experienced in her waking life. Neither of them knew that Catherine Hayes was already planning to ensure they would never discover the truth that connected them. Emily's eyes snapped open at 3:17 a.m., her heart racing from a dream that felt more real than her waking life. She'd been standing in a garden filled with white roses, their sweet fragrance so vivid she could almost smell them now. A man's voice had been calling to her, warm, loving, achingly familiar, saying words she couldn't quite remember, but that made her feel safer than she'd ever felt in her conscious memories. "My little star," the voice had whispered. "Daddy's here." She sat up in her cramped studio apartment, pressing her palms against her temples. These dreams had been happening more frequently since yesterday's incident with Richard Sullivan, each one more intense than the last. The voice, the garden, the overwhelming sense of belonging somewhere. It was starting to feel less like fantasy, and more like fragments of a life she'd somehow forgotten. Emily reached for the glass of water on her nightstand, her hands still trembling from the emotional residue of the dream. The torn photograph sat on her dresser, barely visible in the dim light filtering through her thin curtains. She'd stared at it for hours last night, trying to remember who the missing person might have been, why someone would have torn away half of what seemed like such a happy memory. The worst part was the growing certainty that the missing figure was important, maybe the most important person in her young life. 3 miles away, Alexander was having his own sleepless night. James Morrison's preliminary report lay spread across his dining room table like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that might finally reveal the picture he'd been trying to complete for 22 years. Emily Carter had appeared at St. Catherine's Orphanage on March 21, 2002, just 3 days after Ava's disappearance. The intake notes described a severely injured child with significant head trauma, found unconscious near the church steps with no identification. The attending physician had noted retrograde amnesia, likely caused by the head injury, with little hope of memory recovery. Alexander's hands clenched into fists as he read the medical report. His daughter had been thrown away like garbage, left to die by the monsters Catherine had hired. The fact that she'd survived at all was nothing short of miraculous, But the most compelling evidence was yet to come. James had managed to obtain Emily's blood type from her employment records. O negative, same as Ava. Her height and build matched what Alexander's daughter should be at 29. And there were behavioral patterns that made his heart ache with recognition. According to her supervisor's notes, Emily had an unusual habit of humming while she worked. Specifically, lullabies. The same lullabies Alexander used to sing to Ava at bedtime. She was left-handed, like Ava had been. She had an inexplicable fear of park swings, which the orphanage had noted during her childhood therapy sessions. Most telling of all, Emily had chosen to work in pediatrics. She'd specifically requested assignment to the children's wing, showing an intuitive understanding of young patients that went beyond professional training. She seemed to know exactly how to comfort scared children, speaking to them in a way that suggested deep personal understanding of childhood trauma. Alexander closed the file and walked to his study, where he kept the shrine to his lost daughter. Ava's room had remained untouched for 22 years, her toys arranged exactly as she'd left them, her clothes still hanging in the closet, her bed made with the pink unicorn comforter she'd loved so much. But it was the garden that held his most precious memories. He stepped through the French doors onto his back patio, where hundreds of white roses bloomed in careful arrangements. He'd planted them the year after Ava disappeared, choosing white because they'd been her favorite. Every morning for 2 decades, he'd tended these roses while talking to his absent daughter, telling her about his day, sharing his hopes that somehow, somewhere, she was safe and happy. "I think I found you, my little star," he whispered to the sleeping flowers. "I think you've been right here all along." At St. Raphael Medical Center, Emily was struggling through her morning shift with the exhaustion of another sleepless night weighing on her shoulders. The dreams were becoming more vivid, more frequent, and increasingly difficult to dismiss as mere imagination. She was checking on 8-year-old Sophie Martinez, a little girl recovering from appendix surgery, when Dr. Gabriel Restrepo appeared in the doorway. At 32, Gabriel was one of the most sought-after pediatricians in the hospital. Brilliant, compassionate, and undeniably handsome with his Colombian heritage, evident in his warm brown eyes and easy smile. "How's our patient doing?" Gabriel asked, his accent barely noticeable after 15 years in the United States. "Much better," Emily replied, smoothing Sophie's blanket with the gentle care that had made her legendary among the pediatric staff. "Her pain levels are down, and she asked for ice cream this morning, which I take as a very good sign." Gabriel watched Emily work, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the slight tremor in her hands. "You look tired. Everything okay?" Emily hesitated. Gabriel had always been kind to her, professional but warm, and lately she'd begun to sense something more personal in his attention, but she'd never been good at trusting people with her vulnerabilities. A lifetime in the orphanage system had taught her that emotional self-reliance was often the safest path. "Just having some strange dreams lately," she admitted. "Probably nothing. Want to talk about it over coffee?" Gabriel's invitation was casual, but his eyes held genuine concern. "I mean, if you want to, no pressure." Before Emily could answer, Sophie tugged on her scrub top. "Nurse Emily, do you have kids?" The innocent question hit Emily like a physical blow. It was something patients asked her regularly, usually because of her natural way with children. But today, with the dreams so fresh in her mind and her emotions so raw, the words triggered something unexpected. "No, sweetheart, I don't," Emily managed, her voice barely steady. "You should," Sophie said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that only children possess. "You'd be a really good mommy. You make me feel safe, like my daddy does." Emily excused herself quickly, stepping into the hallway where Gabriel followed with obvious concern. "Emily, what's wrong?" She leaned against the wall, fighting back tears she couldn't explain. "It's just, I keep having these dreams about being someone's little girl, about belonging somewhere, and I know it sounds crazy, but they feel so real, Gabriel. More real than anything I remember from my actual childhood." Gabriel moved closer, his voice gentle. "Have you ever considered that they might not be dreams? That they could be recovered memories from before your accident? The nuns at the orphanage said my memories before age 7 were probably gone forever. Something about the type of head trauma I sustained. Medicine has evolved a lot since then," Gabriel said carefully. Sometimes traumatic memories can resurface, especially when triggered by emotional stress, like yesterday's incident with Sullivan. The mention of Richard Sullivan made Emily's jaw tighten. The video of her humiliation had already started circulating on social media, accompanied by Sullivan's followers posting cruel comments about entitled healthcare workers and people who don't know their place. "He's making my life hell," Emily said quietly. "His people are calling for me to be fired, saying I'm unprofessional, that I don't belong in a place like St. Raphael's." Gabriel's expression darkened. "Richard Sullivan is a bully and a coward. Don't let him make you question your worth, Emily. You're one of the best nurses I've ever worked with." His words were comforting, but Emily could see the deeper emotion in his eyes, something that looked very much like romantic interest mixed with protective instincts. The realization both warmed and terrified her. She'd never let anyone get close enough to matter, too afraid of abandonment, too scarred by a lifetime of temporary relationships and broken promises. "Gabriel, Dr. Restrepo, there you are." Catherine Hayes appeared at the end of the hallway, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor. At 55, Catherine maintained her beauty through careful attention to fashion and cosmetics, but there was something cold in her perfectly made-up features. "The board meeting starts in 5 minutes." Gabriel nodded politely, but his attention remained focused on Emily. "We'll continue this conversation later, okay? And Emily, those dreams you're having, maybe it's time to start paying attention to them." As Gabriel walked away with Catherine, Emily didn't notice the calculating look the older woman shot in her direction. She was too busy processing Gabriel's suggestion, wondering if it was possible that her subconscious mind was trying to tell her something important about her past. That afternoon, during her break, Emily found herself in the hospital chapel, a small, peaceful room where she sometimes came to think. She pulled out her phone and did something she'd never done before. She searched for information about memory recovery after traumatic brain injury. What she found made her heart race. Case studies of patients who'd recovered childhood memories decades after their injuries. Techniques for triggering recall. Support groups for people searching for their identities. For the first time in her life, Emily began to seriously consider that somewhere out there, someone might be missing her as much as she'd always felt like she was missing them. She had no idea that just 4 floors above, Alexander Hayes was staring at her photograph and planning how to approach the daughter he'd never stopped loving. Alexander's hands trembled as he dialed James Morrison's number for the 3rd time that week. The private investigator had been working around the clock, and each piece of evidence he uncovered made Alexander more certain that Emily Carter was his lost daughter, and more desperate to confirm it beyond any shadow of doubt. "Tell me you have something concrete." "James," Alexander said without preamble when the investigator answered. "More than concrete, Alex. I've got DNA evidence." Alexander's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "That coffee cup Emily threw away yesterday. I retrieved it from the hospital trash. Had it tested against the sample you provided from Ava's childhood medical records. Alexander, it's a 99.8% match. Emily Carter is your daughter." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. 22 years of searching, hoping, grieving. And Ava had been working in his own hospital for 3 years. She'd been saving lives just floors below his office while he'd thrown himself into surgery after surgery, trying to fill the void her absence had created. "There's more," James continued. "I traced her path from the orphanage. Stellar academic record despite the memory issues. Full scholarship to nursing school. She's been sending money back to St. Catherine's every month since she started working, helping fund programs for other orphans." Alexander closed his eyes, overwhelmed by pride and heartbreak in equal measure. His little girl had grown up to be exactly the kind of person Margaret would have wanted her to become. Compassionate, generous, dedicated to healing others. "James, I need to approach this carefully. She has no memory of me, no idea who she really is. I can't just walk up and tell her I'm her father." "Agreed. But Alex, there's something else you need to know. I've been monitoring online activity related to Emily, and Richard Sullivan's campaign against her is escalating. He's created a petition calling for her dismissal, and it's gaining traction among his wealthy social circle." Alexander's protective instincts flared instantly. "What kind of petition?" "Remove unprofessional staff from St. Raphael's Medical Center. It's disgusting, frankly. He's painting Emily as incompetent and entitled. using his influence to destroy her reputation. The petition has over 2,000 signatures already. That bastard, Alexander growled. He has no idea he's attacking my daughter. But even as he spoke the words, Alexander realized the cruel irony. Richard Sullivan had no way of knowing that his public humiliation campaign was targeting the child of the man he'd always claimed to admire. Sullivan had built his business empire partly to impress Alexander, viewing him as a mentor figure in Chicago's elite circles. There's one more thing, Alex. I've been digging into Catherine's finances, and there are some irregularities around the time of Ava's disappearance. Large cash withdrawals, payments to individuals with criminal records. I think we need to seriously consider that Catherine might have been involved. The suggestion hit Alexander like ice water. Catherine, who had comforted him through the darkest period of his life. Catherine, who had stood by his side during every failed investigation, every false lead, every crushing disappointment. That's impossible, James. Catherine loved Ava. She was devastated when she disappeared. Alex, I've been doing this for 30 years. Trust me when I tell you that the people closest to us are often capable of the greatest betrayals. I'm not saying Catherine definitely did this, but we can't rule it out. Alexander ended the call, feeling like his entire world was shifting beneath his feet. Emily was Ava. He was certain of that now, but the possibility that Catherine might have orchestrated their separation was almost too horrific to contemplate. Meanwhile, Catherine Hayes was experiencing her own form of panic as she sat in her pristine downtown condo, scrolling through the hospital's security footage on her laptop. As a member of the hospital's board of directors, she had access to most surveillance systems, and what she'd seen in Alexander's recent behavior patterns was setting off every alarm bell in her carefully constructed web of deception. Alexander had been spending unusual amounts of time researching hospital personnel files. He'd been making discreet inquiries about Emily Carter's background. Most damning of all, she'd seen him studying Emily during their brief interactions with an intensity that suggested recognition. Catherine had spent 22 years meticulously sabotaging any investigation that might lead Alexander back to his daughter. She'd paid off witnesses, destroyed evidence, and even eliminated a few individuals who'd gotten too close to the truth. Her entire adult life had been devoted to keeping Ava Hayes buried while positioning herself as Alexander's closest confidant. Now, the one scenario she'd never prepared for was unfolding before her eyes. Ava had found her way back on her own. Catherine opened her encrypted phone and dialed a number she'd hoped never to use again. Vincent Caruso answered on the second ring, his gravelly voice instantly recognizable despite the passage of years. Well, Catherine Hayes. I figured you for dead by now. I need your services again. Vincent, the girl from 22 years ago. She's become a problem. There was a long pause. That job was supposed to be permanent. You said the kid wouldn't survive the head trauma. Plans change. She's alive. She's working at my brother-in-law's hospital. And he's starting to put the pieces together. I need her eliminated before she remembers who she is. This is going to cost you a lot. Killing a hospital employee is risky business, especially with all the security cameras these days. Catherine glanced at her bank account balance. Millions accumulated through careful manipulation of Alexander's grief-induced generosity over the years. Money is no object. Just make it look like an accident. Emily was completely unaware of the forces gathering around her as she finished her evening shift. The dreams had become so vivid that she'd started keeping a notebook beside her bed, writing down every detail she could remember upon waking. Gardens with white roses, a man's gentle voice singing lullabies, the feeling of being completely, unconditionally loved. She was gathering her things when Gabriel appeared beside her locker. "How are you holding up?" he asked, noting the exhaustion in her features. "Honestly, I feel like I'm losing my mind. These dreams or memories or whatever they are, they're so real, Gabriel. And then I wake up and remember that I'm nobody special, just an orphan with a made-up name and no real history." Gabriel moved closer, his voice gentle but firm. "Emily, you are not nobody special. You're one of the most extraordinary people I've ever met. You save lives every day. You've overcome incredible trauma, and you've built a meaningful life from nothing. That's not nothing. That's everything." His words stirred something warm in Emily's chest. But before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a social media notification. Richard Sullivan had posted another video, this one showing Emily rudely ignoring him while playing hero with a child who probably wasn't even that sick. The comments were vicious. People calling her a social climber, suggesting she was putting on a show for attention, questioning her qualifications and competence. Several wealthy donors to the hospital had shared the video, adding their own commentary about entitled staff who needed to know their place. "This is getting worse," Emily said quietly, scrolling through the endless stream of cruel comments. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I don't belong at St. Raphael's. Don't you dare let them break you," Gabriel said fiercely. "Richard Sullivan is a small, petty man who gets his power from tearing others down. You belong here, Emily. You belong wherever you choose to be." The conviction in his voice made Emily look up, and she saw something in his eyes that took her breath away. Gabriel wasn't just defending her as a colleague or even as a friend. The way he was looking at her, the passion in his voice, he cared about her in a way that went far beyond professional respect. "Gabriel, I know this might not be the right time," he interrupted, "but I need you to know that I'm falling in love with you, Emily. You're the strongest, most compassionate person I've ever known, and watching Sullivan try to destroy you is killing me." Emily stared at him, overwhelmed by his confession and by her own unexpected response to it. She'd never allowed herself to imagine being loved by someone like Gabriel, someone good, stable, and genuinely caring. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "Love, relationships, trusting someone with my heart. I've never had anyone who stayed." "Then let me be your first," Gabriel said softly. "Let me show you what it feels like to have someone who will never leave." As Emily looked into Gabriel's sincere eyes, she had no idea that 4 floors above them, her biological father was planning how to reveal himself to the daughter he'd never stopped loving. She also didn't know that Catherine Hayes was at that very moment arranging for her permanent disappearance. The 3 people who would determine Emily's future were all moving toward their fateful convergence, and none of them could have predicted how dramatically their lives were about to change. Alexander spent the entire night pacing his study. James Morrison's final report spread across his mahogany desk like irrefutable evidence of a miracle. DNA results, medical records, behavioral analyses, childhood photographs. Everything pointed to the impossible truth that Emily Carter was his lost daughter Ava, but it was the last piece of evidence that had shattered his remaining doubts completely. James had somehow obtained Emily's childhood medical records from St. Catherine's Orphanage, buried in the intake. Notes was a detail that made Alexander's hands shake. The unconscious child had been clutching a small pink hair ribbon when she was found, the same ribbon Alexander had tied in Ava's hair on the morning of her disappearance. A ribbon he'd chosen because it matched her birthday dress from 3 days earlier. "My little star," he whispered to the empty room, using the pet name he'd given Ava when she was 3 years old and fascinated by astronomy. "I found you. After 22 years, I finally found you." The question now was how to approach her. Emily had no memory of her life before the age of 7. To her, he was simply Dr. Hayes, the respected but distant chief of surgery who rarely interacted with nursing staff. How do you tell someone that you're the father they never knew they had? How do you explain 22 years of absence without revealing the horrific truth about their disappearance? Alexander picked up his phone and dialed James's number, knowing the investigator would be awake despite the early hour. "I need you to approach Emily carefully," Alexander said. "I want you to pose as someone researching missing children cases from the early 2000s. See if you can trigger any memories without revealing who I am or what we suspect. Alex, are you sure that's wise? If she really is Ava, and if Catherine was involved in her disappearance, approaching Emily could put her in danger." The mention of Catherine sent ice through Alexander's veins. He'd been trying to avoid thinking about James's suspicions regarding his sister-in-law, but the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. The financial irregularities, the mysterious cash withdrawals, the way Catherine had always managed to be present during every investigative lead, perfectly positioned to sabotage any progress. "Do it anyway," Alexander said finally. "But be extremely careful. If Catherine is involved, she's had 22 years to perfect her methods." 3 floors below Alexander's office, Emily was experiencing the most vivid dream yet. She was 7 years old again, standing in a beautiful kitchen with sunlight streaming through lace curtains. A man with kind eyes and gentle hands was teaching her to flip pancakes, his voice warm with laughter as batter splattered across the counter. "Careful there, my little star. The secret is all in the wrist. Like this, Daddy. Perfect. You're going to be the best pancake maker in all of Chicago." Emily woke with tears streaming down her face. The dream so real she could almost taste the vanilla-scented pancakes, could almost feel the warmth of her father's hand guiding hers. The word "Daddy" echoed in her mind with such profound longing that it physically hurt. She sat up in bed, reaching for the notebook she'd started keeping. This dream was different from the others. More specific, more detailed. She could remember the pattern on the curtains, the color of the man's shirt, the way morning light had caught the gold flecks in his eyes that looked remarkably similar to Dr. Alexander Hayes's eyes. The thought hit Emily like lightning. She'd noticed Dr. Hayes's distinctive blue-green eyes during their few interactions. But now, with the dream so fresh in her memory, the resemblance was unmistakable. Could it be coincidence? Or was her subconscious mind trying to tell her something important? Meanwhile, Catherine Hayes was sitting in her car outside Emily's apartment building, watching the young woman's bedroom window with the focused attention of a predator. Vincent Caruso had confirmed that the job would be completed within 48 hours. But Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Alexander's behavior had become increasingly suspicious. Yesterday, she'd caught him staring at Emily during their brief encounter in the elevator, with an expression she'd never seen before. Hope mixed with desperate longing. If Alexander figured out the truth before Vincent could eliminate the problem permanently, everything Catherine had worked for would crumble. Her phone rang, displaying Alexander's number. "Good morning, Alexander. You're up early." "Catherine, I need to ask you something. And I want you to be completely honest with me." Catherine's blood ran cold, but her voice remained perfectly steady. "Of course. What is it? Do you remember anything unusual about the day Ava disappeared? Anything you might not have mentioned to the police at the time?" "Alexander, you know I've told you everything. We went to Lincoln Park. She was playing on the swings, and when I turned around, she was gone. I've replayed that day in my mind 1,000 times, wishing I could have done something different." Catherine delivered the lie with practiced ease. The same story she'd been telling for 22 years, but she could hear something different in Alexander's voice, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. "The men who took her, Catherine, did you ever get a sense that this wasn't random? That maybe they knew who she was? Who I was? What are you suggesting?" Catherine's heart was racing, but she kept her tone carefully controlled. "I'm suggesting that maybe someone wanted to hurt me by taking the thing I loved most in the world." Catherine closed her eyes, recognizing the dangerous territory this conversation was heading toward. "Alexander, you're scaring me. Has something happened? Have you learned something new about Ava's case?" There was a long pause before Alexander spoke again. "Maybe. I'll talk to you later." "Catherine." The line went dead, leaving Catherine staring at her phone in growing panic. Alexander knew something. She was certain of it, which meant Vincent would have to move faster than planned. At the hospital, Emily was struggling to focus on her morning rounds. The dreams were becoming so frequent and so vivid that the line between sleeping and waking was beginning to blur. She found herself staring at Dr. Hayes whenever he passed through the pediatric wing, searching his face for any sign of recognition, any hint that he might know more about her past than he was letting on. It was during her lunch break that the stranger approached her. "Miss Carter, my name is Tom Wilson. I'm a researcher working on a documentary about missing children from the early 2000s. I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions about your experiences in the foster care system." Emily looked up from her salad to find a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. Something about him seemed trustworthy, though she couldn't explain why. "I wasn't exactly in foster care," Emily said carefully. "I grew up in an orphanage after being found with amnesia from a head injury. Actually, that's exactly the kind of case I'm researching. Children who were found without identification, possibly victims of abduction or trafficking. Would you be willing to share your story?" Emily hesitated. She'd never talked publicly about her past, had never even fully processed the trauma of waking up as a 7-year-old with no memory of her previous life. But something about this man's approach felt different. Professional but genuinely caring. "What exactly do you want to know? Anything you remember from the time before your injury, dreams, fragments, feelings?" Sometimes the subconscious holds on to things the conscious mind can't access. Emily's breath caught. I have been having dreams lately. More like memories, actually. A man's voice calling me, my little star. A kitchen with lace curtains. Gardens full of white roses. She watched the researcher's face carefully as she spoke, noting the way his eyes widened slightly at the mention of white roses. These dreams, do you see the man's face clearly? Not completely, but his eyes. They're very distinctive, blue-green, with gold flecks. Emily paused, then added quietly, they look exactly like Dr. Hayes's eyes. The researcher, James Morrison. Though Emily didn't know his real name, felt his heart race. Alexander had been right to trust his instincts. Emily was definitely Ava, and her recovered memories were already pointing her toward her father. Miss Carter, would you be willing to meet with a specialist who works with recovered memory cases? Someone who might be able to help you access more of these suppressed memories. Emily nodded slowly. For the first time in her life, she felt like someone was taking her seriously, like her fragmented memories might actually mean something important. Yes, she said. I think it's time I found out who I really am. As James Morrison left the hospital, he had no idea that Catherine Hayes had been watching their entire interaction from across the cafeteria, nor did he know that Catherine was already texting Vincent Caruso with a simple message. Move tonight. The situation is critical. The race to save Emily's life and reunite her with her father had officially begun. Alexander stood outside the door he hadn't opened in 22 years, his hand trembling as he turned the antique brass handle. Ava's bedroom looked exactly as she'd left it on that terrible morning. Her stuffed animals arranged on the window seat, her books stacked neatly on the shelves, her pink unicorn comforter folded at the foot of her small bed. But it was the photographs covering her dresser that had drawn him here tonight. Pictures of birthday parties, family vacations, quiet moments at home, an entire childhood preserved in glossy memories. Alexander picked up his favorite, Ava, at age 5, gap-toothed and giggling as she helped him plant white roses in the garden. I'm bringing you home tomorrow, my little star, he whispered to the empty room. I'm finally bringing you home. James Morrison had called an hour ago with the final confirmation Alexander needed. Emily Carter had agreed to undergo hypnotherapy to recover her lost memories. More importantly, she'd mentioned the white roses and the pet name, Little Star, details that no one except Alexander and Ava could have known. Tomorrow, he would reveal the truth. Tomorrow, he would show Emily this room, this house, this life that had been waiting for her return. Tomorrow, his daughter would finally come home. Alexander had no idea that Catherine was at that moment watching his house from across the street, her phone pressed to her ear as she gave Vincent Caruso final instructions. It has to look accidental, Catherine hissed. A robbery gone wrong, maybe, or a car accident on her way home from work. I don't care how you do it. Just make sure Emily Carter doesn't live to see sunrise. Emily finished her evening shift in a daze, her mind reeling from the conversation with the documentary researcher. For the first time in her adult life, someone was taking her fractured memories seriously, treating them as potential evidence rather than trauma-induced fantasies. Gabriel had stayed late to walk her to her car, his protective instincts heightened by Richard Sullivan's escalating online campaign. The petition calling for Emily's dismissal now had over 5,000 signatures, and Sullivan's social media followers had begun showing up at the hospital to harass her directly. I still can't believe people are this cruel, Gabriel said as they walked through the parking garage. Sullivan is a grown man acting like a spoiled child because he didn't get his way immediately. Maybe he's right, though, Emily said quietly. Maybe I don't belong at St. Raphael's. Maybe someone like me should stick to community clinics where people won't expect so much. Gabriel stopped walking and turned to face her, his eyes flashing with anger. Don't you dare let him make you believe that. You saved Marcus Thompson's life while Sullivan was throwing his tantrum. You've saved dozens of children during your time here. If anyone doesn't belong at this hospital, it's him. Emily felt tears prick her eyes at Gabriel's fierce defense. Why do you care so much? You barely knew me before all this started. Because I've been watching you for 3 years, Gabriel admitted, his voice softening. I've seen how you stay late with scared children, how you remember every patient's name, how you fight for people who can't fight for themselves. You're the best nurse in this hospital, Emily, and you're also the kindest person I've ever met. Before Emily could respond, Gabriel cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It was gentle and sweet, and filled with 3 years of unspoken affection. When they broke apart, Emily felt something she'd never experienced before. The absolute certainty that someone loved her exactly as she was. "Gabriel, you don't have to say anything," he said softly. "I just needed you to know how I feel. Whatever happens with these recovered memories, whatever you discover about your past, I want to be part of your future." Emily nodded, too overwhelmed with emotion to speak, as Gabriel walked her to her car. Neither of them noticed the black sedan following them at a distance, or the man behind the wheel who was calculating the best moment to strike. Vincent Caruso had been in the assassination business for 30 years, and he'd learned that timing was everything. Emily Carter's apartment building was too well lit, too visible from the street, but the route she took home from the hospital included several isolated stretches of road where an accident could be easily arranged. He'd been following Emily for 3 days, learning her patterns, identifying the perfect location. Tonight, as she drove through Lincoln Park, the same park where he'd abandoned her 22 years ago, he would finish what Catherine Hayes had paid him to start. The irony wasn't lost on him. Vincent accelerated his vehicle, preparing to ram Emily's small Honda from behind and send her careening into the concrete barrier. At 60 miles per hour, the impact would be fatal. The police would rule it a tragic accident. Another tired healthcare worker who fell asleep at the wheel after a long shift. But as Vincent closed the distance between their vehicles, Emily's brake lights suddenly flashed. She was pulling over, her car coasting to a stop on the shoulder. Vincent cursed and drove past, unable to execute his plan without making it obvious that her death was intentional. Emily sat in her parked car, her hands gripping the steering wheel as another wave of recovered memory crashed over her. This one was more vivid than any dream she'd experienced. So real she could smell the spring air, feel the rough bark of the oak tree, hear the distant sound of children playing. She was 7 years old, running through Lincoln Park toward the playground, when strong hands grabbed her from behind. A cloth pressed over her nose and mouth, filling her lungs with a chemical smell that made the world spin and fade. "Don't hurt the kid more than necessary," a gruff voice had said. "The lady just wants her gone." "What lady?" another voice had asked. "Didn't give her name. Just said the girl's father needed to suffer." Emily gasped, the memory hitting her with the force of a physical blow. She'd been kidnapped. Someone had deliberately taken her from her family, had wanted to hurt her father by stealing his child. But who and why? Couldn't she remember anything about her life before that terrible moment? Her phone rang, startling her from the recovered memory. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "Miss Carter, this is Tom Wilson, the researcher we spoke with earlier. I know this is unusual, but I have someone who'd like to meet with you tonight. Someone who might be able to help you make sense of these memories you've been recovering." Emily hesitated. It was nearly midnight, and meeting a stranger seemed risky, but the memory of her kidnapping was so fresh, so terrifying, that she desperately wanted answers. "Where?" she asked. "The address I'm sending you. It's a private residence, but I promise you'll be safe. The person you're meeting has been searching for answers about your case for over 20 years. Emily's heart began to race. Someone had been searching for her. Someone had cared enough to spend decades looking for a lost little girl. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, she said. As Emily pulled back into traffic, she didn't notice the black sedan making a U-turn to follow her, or Vincent Caruso speaking urgently into his phone. "She's going somewhere else. Some kind of meeting. Should I take her out now or wait?" Catherine's voice crackled through the speaker, sharp with panic. "Wait. Find out where she's going and who she's meeting. If it's what I think it is, we may need to eliminate more than just Emily." Alexander paced his living room, checking his watch every few minutes. James had called to say Emily was coming, that she'd agreed to meet with someone who might have answers about her past. Alexander had spent the last hour rehearsing what he would say, how he would reveal the truth that would change both their lives forever. The doorbell rang at 12:43 a.m. Alexander took a deep breath, said a silent prayer, and opened the door to find his daughter standing on his front porch. Emily looked nervous but determined, her green eyes, so much like Margaret's, searching his face with an expression of cautious hope. "Dr. Hayes," Emily's voice was barely a whisper, "I don't understand. Why did the researcher send me to your house? Alexander stepped aside to let her in, his heart breaking at the confusion in her voice. "Because, my darling girl, I'm not just doctor. Hayes, I'm your father, and I've been looking for you for 22 years. Emily stared at him, her face cycling through shock, disbelief, and dawning recognition as the truth hit her like a tidal wave. "My little star," Alexander whispered, using the pet name that had haunted her dreams. Emily's knees buckled, and Alexander caught her as 22 years of suppressed memories came flooding back all at once. His voice, his eyes, his gentle hands. Suddenly, everything made perfect sense. "Daddy," Emily's voice broke on the word she hadn't spoken in over 2 decades. "Yes, sweetheart. Daddy's here. I found you. I finally found you." As father and daughter embraced for the first time in 22 years, neither of them saw Vincent Caruso positioning himself outside the window, his rifle trained on Emily's heart. The red laser dot wavered on Emily's chest as Vincent Caruso adjusted his scope, his finger hovering over the trigger. Through the living room window, he could see Alexander Hayes embracing the woman who had become the biggest threat to Catherine's carefully constructed life. But something made Vincent hesitate. 22 years ago, he'd been a different man. Younger, harder, willing to do anything for the right price. Now, at 58, with grandchildren of his own, the idea of killing a reunion between father and daughter left a bitter taste in his mouth. His phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. "Take the shot now." Vincent lowered his rifle and reached for his phone instead. "There's been a complication," he told Catherine when she answered. "The target is with Alexander Hayes. If I kill her now, he'll be a witness. Then kill them both." Catherine's voice was ice cold with desperation. "Make it look like a break-in. I'll make sure you're compensated for the additional risk." Vincent stared through his scope at Alexander's face, a face transformed by joy and wonder as he held his lost daughter. 22 years of searching had ended in this moment, and Vincent was being asked to destroy it with a single bullet. "I'm out," Vincent said quietly. "Find someone else to clean up your mess, Catherine. This job ends now." He hung up the phone and began dismantling his rifle. Some jobs weren't worth the money, no matter how desperate the client became. Inside Alexander's house, Emily sat on the couch she'd played on as a child, her hands trembling as memories continued to surface like fragments of a shattered mirror, finally reflecting a complete image. "I remember this room," she whispered, looking around the living room that had remained unchanged since her childhood. The fireplace, the piano, the way the morning light comes through those windows. Alexander sat beside her, maintaining enough distance to avoid overwhelming her while staying close enough to offer comfort. "You used to hide behind that piano when you didn't want to take your medicine. You'd make me count to 10 before you'd come out." Emily laughed through her tears. "I remember. And you'd always pretend you couldn't find me, even though my feet were sticking out. Your favorite hiding spot was actually upstairs," Alexander said gently. "Would you like to see your room? I kept everything exactly the way you left it." Emily nodded, still struggling to process the magnitude of what was happening. As they climbed the familiar staircase, more memories flooded back. The loose banister she used to slide down when Alexander wasn't looking. The family portraits lining the hallway, including several of a beautiful woman with kind eyes. "That's your mother, Margaret," Alexander said, noticing where Emily's gaze had stopped. "You have her eyes, her smile. She died 8 months before you disappeared." "I wish I could remember her," Emily said sadly. "She loved you more than life itself. We both did. When you vanished," Alexander's voice broke. "I spent every day for 22 years wondering if you were safe, if you were happy, if you knew how much you were loved." They stopped outside a door painted soft yellow, with a wooden sign reading Ava's room in purple letters. Alexander turned the handle and stepped back, letting Emily enter first. The room was a shrine to a 7-year-old's dreams, stuffed animals arranged on the window seat, children's books organized by color, art supplies neatly stored in a white desk. Emily walked to the closet and found her old clothes still hanging there, dresses she remembered wearing, shoes she'd outgrown, a pink coat she'd loved because it had pockets shaped like hearts. "You kept everything," Emily breathed, overwhelmed by the evidence of a father's unwavering love. "I couldn't let go," Alexander admitted. "Every night, I'd come in here and read you a story, just in case somehow you could hear me. I'd tell you about my day, about the patients I'd helped, about how proud I was of the brave little girl you'd been. Emily picked up a worn teddy bear from the bed, brown fur faded from countless hugs, one eye slightly loose from a childhood accident. The moment she held him, another memory crashed over her. "Mr. Buttons," she whispered. "I used to tell him all my secrets. You took him everywhere. The morning you disappeared. You forgot him here because you were so excited about going to the park with Catherine." The mention of Catherine's name made Emily look up sharply. "Catherine, your sister-in-law, Catherine." Alexander's expression darkened. "Yes, she was the one watching you when you were taken. She claimed you vanished while she was distracted, but..." He hesitated, then decided Emily deserved the complete truth. "I'm beginning to suspect that Catherine might have been involved in your disappearance." Emily's blood ran cold. Catherine Hayes, the elegant board member who'd always been politely distant at the hospital, had been responsible for the kidnapping that destroyed her childhood. Why would she do that to me? To you? Alexander sat heavily on the edge of the small bed. "Catherine was always obsessed with me, even before I married your mother. When Margaret died, Catherine positioned herself as my emotional support system. With you gone, I became completely dependent on her companionship. She spent 22 years as the most important person in my life, and if I came back, she'd lose everything. Her influence, her position, her hold over me. My love for you would always come first." Emily sank into the child-sized rocking chair by the window. The same chair where Alexander had read her bedtime stories decades ago. "The men who kidnapped me. I remember one of them saying something about the lady who wanted me gone. They said my father needed to suffer." Alexander's hands clenched into fists. "I'm going to destroy her. 22 years of lies, of sabotaging every investigation, of pretending to comfort me while she was the one who'd stolen my child. We need proof," Emily said, her nursing instincts kicking in even amid the emotional chaos. "Accusations won't be enough. We need evidence that will hold up in court." Alexander pulled out his phone and dialed James Morrison's number. When the investigator answered, Alexander put the call on speaker so Emily could hear. "James, it's Alexander. Emily is here with me. She remembers the kidnapping, and she confirms our suspicions about Catherine. We need you to dig deeper into Catherine's financial records, her connections to the men who took Ava. I want enough evidence to put her away for life." "I'm on it," James replied. "But Alex, be careful. If Catherine realizes that Emily has recovered her memories and that you know the truth, she might do something desperate." Alexander and Emily exchanged worried glances. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Catherine has spent 2 decades covering her tracks. She's not going to let everything unravel without a fight. Consider her extremely dangerous until she's behind bars." 20 miles away, Catherine was having her own crisis. Vincent's refusal to complete the job had left her with limited options, and time was running out. If Alexander and Emily spent the night together comparing memories and evidence, Catherine's carefully constructed life would collapse by morning. She scrolled through her contacts until she found another number. Tommy Ricci, a younger, hungrier criminal who'd been trying to earn her business for years. Tommy answered on the first ring. "Catherine Hayes, I need a favor." "Name it." "There's a house in Lincoln Park. 2 people inside who have become problematic for my business interests. I need them eliminated tonight, and I need it to look like a home invasion." "How much?" $500,000. "Cash, half up front." Tommy whistled low. "For that kind of money, you've got yourself a deal. Text me the address." Catherine ended the call and immediately began transferring funds from her hidden offshore accounts. She'd spent decades accumulating wealth through her manipulation of Alexander. And now, every penny of it would be worth it to preserve her secret. But as she prepared to send 2 more killers after Emily and Alexander, Catherine had no idea that Vincent Caruso was having a change of heart about his early retirement from the assassination business. Vincent had spent the last hour thinking about the joy on Alexander Hayes' face when he'd embraced his lost daughter. Some reunions were sacred, even to a man who'd made his living destroying lives. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized but never expected to use. "Chicago Police Department tip line. I have information about a 22-year-old kidnapping case, and there's about to be a double murder tonight unless you act fast." The race to save Alexander and Emily had officially begun, with Catherine's final gambit already in motion. At 2:47 a.m., Alexander's security system chimed softly, indicating motion in the front yard. He and Emily had been going through photo albums, piecing together the memories that 22 years of separation had stolen from them. Both looked up as the subtle alarm continued. "Probably just a raccoon," Alexander said, but his voice carried an edge of concern. James Morrison's warning about Catherine's desperation had put them both on high alert. Emily moved to the window and peered through the curtains. "Dad, there are 2 men coming up the walkway. They don't look like they belong in this neighborhood." The word "dad" still sounded foreign on her lips, but increasingly natural with each passing hour. Alexander joined her at the window, his heart sinking as he saw Tommy Ricci and his partner approaching the front door with the purposeful stride of professionals. "Call 911, Alexander whispered urgently. "Tell them we have armed intruders." But before Emily could reach for her phone, the front door exploded inward with a deafening crash. Tommy Ricci stood in the doorway, a sawed-off shotgun in his hands, and a cold smile on his face. "Dr. Alexander Hayes and Miss Emily Carter, I presume. Catherine Hayes sends her regards." Alexander stepped protectively in front of Emily, his mind racing through their limited options. The panic room was upstairs, but they'd never make it past the armed men. His own gun was locked in the bedroom safe, equally unreachable. "Catherine hired you," Alexander said. Not a question, but a statement of devastating realization. "She's been trying to eliminate Emily since she discovered the truth." Tommy shrugged. "Nothing personal, Doc. Just business. Catherine's paying us $500,000 to make this look like a home invasion gone wrong. Tragic story. Respected surgeon and young nurse killed by random criminals. You don't have to do this," Emily said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Whatever she's paying you, my father can double it. Nice try, sweetheart, but Catherine's money is already in my account. Besides, she made it very clear what happens to people who disappoint her." Tommy raised the shotgun, but before he could pull the trigger, the house erupted in chaos. The front windows exploded inward as a SWAT team breached the building simultaneously from multiple entry points. Red laser sights danced across Tommy's chest as tactical officers shouted commands from every direction. "Drop your weapons. Drop your weapons now." Tommy's partner immediately threw down his gun and hit the ground, smart enough to recognize when a situation had gone impossibly wrong. But Tommy, high on methamphetamines and desperate to complete the job that would set him up for life, swung his shotgun toward Emily. "If I can't have the money, nobody gets to live." Alexander threw himself between the gun and his daughter, the same protective instinct that had driven him to search for 22 years now compelling him to sacrifice his life for hers. The shotgun blast was deafening in the confined space, but it wasn't Tommy who had fired. Vincent Caruso stood in the shattered doorway, a smoking pistol in his hand, and Tommy Ricci's body crumpling to the floor. The old assassin had arrived just in time to prevent the massacre Catherine had orchestrated. "Vincent," Emily stared at the man who had kidnapped her as a child, trying to process why he'd just saved her life. 22 years ago, I was a different man," Vincent said quietly, lowering his weapon as police swarmed the house. "I did terrible things for money, including taking you from your father. Tonight, I decided to try being a better person." Detective Sarah Martinez, who had been working cold cases for 15 years, stepped through the wreckage with a team of forensic specialists. "Mr. Hayes, Miss Carter, are you both unharmed?" Alexander nodded, his arm still wrapped protectively around Emily. "How did you know to come here?" "Anonymous tip about 90 minutes ago. Caller provided detailed information about a 22-year-old kidnapping case and said there would be an attempt on your lives tonight. When we ran the address through our system and saw it belonged to Alexander Hayes, we cross-referenced it with the Ava Hayes missing person case." Detective Martinez looked at Emily with growing recognition. "You're her, aren't you?" "You're Ava Hayes." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I just remembered tonight. My father showed me who I really am." "Well, then you'll be very interested to know that we've been building a case against Catherine Hayes for the past 6 months. Your kidnapping wasn't her only crime. She's been embezzling from the hospital, bribing city officials, and we suspect she's been involved in at least 3 other disappearances over the years." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Catherine Hayes appeared in the doorway. She was immaculately dressed despite the early hour, her makeup perfect and her expression carefully composed into one of concerned innocence. Alexander, thank God you're safe. I heard about the break-in on my police scanner and came immediately. Her gaze moved to Emily with calculated surprise. And Emily, what are you doing here at this hour? Cut the act, Catherine, Alexander said coldly. We know everything. Emily remembers the kidnapping. Vincent has confessed to his role, and the police have enough evidence to put you away for the rest of your life. Catherine's mask of innocence slipped for just a moment, revealing the calculating predator beneath. I have no idea what you're talking about, Alexander. You're obviously traumatized by this home invasion. The men you hired are dead or arrested, Detective Martinez interrupted. Vincent Caruso has provided a full confession detailing your role in Ava's kidnapping 22 years ago. We have financial records showing payments to known criminals, recorded conversations, and witness testimony. Catherine Hayes, you're under arrest for kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder, and first-degree murder. Catherine's composure finally cracked completely. You don't understand, she screamed, her voice becoming shrill and desperate. I loved Alexander first, before Margaret, before that little brat. I was the one who understood him. I deserved to be his wife. You destroyed my family, Alexander said quietly, his voice carrying 22 years of suppressed rage. You stole my daughter, made me believe she was dead, and spent decades pretending to comfort me while you were the source of my pain. I gave you everything, Catherine shrieked as the officers moved to handcuff her. I was there for you every single day. I listened to you cry. I helped you search. I made you meals. I held you when you had nightmares. Where's my gratitude for that? Emily stepped forward, her face a mask of calm, despite the fury burning in her green eyes. You want gratitude? You kidnapped a 7-year-old child, left her with brain damage, and robbed her of 22 years with her father. You hired men to kill us both tonight. The only thing you deserve is to spend the rest of your life in prison, thinking about the lives you destroyed. Catherine lunged toward Emily with a snarl of rage, but the handcuffs and officers restrained her before she could make contact. As they dragged her toward the police car, she continued screaming threats and justifications. Her carefully maintained facade completely shattered, Richard Sullivan chose that moment to arrive, having heard about the incident through his police scanner connections. He stood in Alexander's destroyed living room, staring at Emily with dawning horror as the full truth of the situation became clear. Oh my God, Richard whispered. Emily, your doctor, Hayes' daughter, his missing daughter, and I've been trying to destroy your career. Emily looked at the man who had humiliated her, who had used his wealth and influence to make her life miserable, and saw not a monster, but a broken, ashamed human being. Yes, Richard, you have. The question is, what are you going to do about it? As the sun began to rise over Chicago, casting golden light through the shattered windows of Alexander's home, father and daughter stood together, finally reunited after more than 2 decades apart. The nightmare was over. The healing could finally begin. 6 months later, Emily sat in the witness stand of the Cook County Courthouse, her hand resting on the Bible as she prepared to give testimony that would determine Catherine Hayes' fate. The courtroom was packed with media, hospital staff, and members of Chicago's medical community who had followed the case with fascination and horror. Catherine sat at the defendant's table, her once immaculate appearance now haggard after months in jail. The woman who had spent decades manipulating everyone around her with charm and calculated emotion now looked like what she truly was, a desperate criminal facing the consequences of her actions. Miss Carter, the prosecutor began gently, can you tell the court about your memories of March 18th? 2002. Emily took a deep breath, her eyes finding her father in the gallery. Alexander gave her an encouraging nod, his presence providing the strength she needed to relive the most traumatic day of her childhood. I remember being at Lincoln Park with my Aunt Catherine. She bought me an ice cream cone and told me to stay by the playground while she made a phone call. Then 2 men approached me. When I started to run, they grabbed me and put something over my face that made me dizzy. Do you remember anything the men said? One of them asked if they should hurt me more than necessary. The other one said, the lady just wants her gone, and that the girl's father needed to suffer. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Catherine's lawyer objected, but the judge overruled him. Emily's recovered memories, supported by Vincent Caruso's detailed confession and corroborating evidence, painted a clear picture of premeditated kidnapping, Miss Carter, how has this experience affected your relationship with the defendant? Emily looked directly at Catherine, who refused to meet her eyes. Catherine Hayes stole 22 years from me and my father. She robbed me of my childhood, my memories, and my identity. But more than that, she stole my father's joy, his peace of mind, and his ability to trust anyone completely. Emily paused, her voice becoming stronger. However, I forgive her, not because she deserves forgiveness, but because carrying hatred would only continue the damage she's already caused. My father and I have found each other again, and no amount of Catherine's bitterness can destroy that. Catherine's composure finally cracked. You self-righteous little brat, she screamed, jumping to her feet. You think you're so special because Alexander chose you over me. I gave him everything. Order. Judge Williams banged his gavel as bailiffs moved to restrain Catherine. Ms. Hayes, you will remain seated and silent, or you will be removed from this courtroom. The prosecution spent the next 3 days presenting overwhelming evidence. Financial records showed Catherine had paid Vincent Caruso $200,000 for the kidnapping. Phone records revealed dozens of calls between Catherine and known criminals over the years. Most damning of all, Vincent Caruso himself testified in exchange for a reduced sentence, detailing not only Ava's kidnapping, but Catherine's systematic sabotage of every investigation that might have led to the truth. She was obsessed, Vincent testified. Every time someone got close to finding the kid, Catherine would call me. Sometimes it was bribing witnesses to disappear. Sometimes it was destroying evidence. Twice. She had me eliminate people who knew too much. The defense tried to paint Catherine as a woman driven mad by unrequited love, but the evidence was too overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: kidnapping, conspiracy, first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and extortion. Judge Williams sentenced Catherine Hayes to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiffs led Catherine away in shackles, she turned one last time toward Alexander and Emily. This isn't over, she hissed. You'll never be truly happy knowing what I did to your precious little girl. Alexander stood and walked to the barrier separating the gallery from the courtroom floor. Catherine, you're wrong. We've already found our happiness, and it's something you could never understand. It's not built on obsession or control. It's built on love, forgiveness, and the simple joy of being together. Catherine's face contorted with rage as she was dragged from the courtroom, her voice echoing through the halls as she continued screaming threats that no one bothered to hear. Outside the courthouse, Richard Sullivan waited nervously by his Mercedes, his usual confidence replaced by genuine humility. Over the past 6 months, he had undergone a complete transformation, using his wealth and influence to undo the damage he'd caused Emily while embarking on a journey of personal redemption. Emily, Dr. Hayes, Richard approached them cautiously. I know I have no right to ask for your time, but I wanted to update you on the programs we've established. Emily and Alexander exchanged glances. Richard's efforts to make amends had been impressive and seemed genuinely motivated by remorse rather than public relations. Tell us, Emily said simply. The Sullivan Foundation has opened 12 free clinics across Chicago, staffed entirely by volunteer medical professionals. We've also established a scholarship program for orphan children pursuing medical careers, the Ava Hayes Memorial Scholarship Program. If you'll permit me to keep that name now that we know who you really are. Alexander nodded appreciatively. That's generous, Richard. But what about you personally? Have you learned anything from this experience? Richard's eyes filled with genuine emotion. I learned that wealth and influence are meaningless if you use them to hurt people. I learned that someone's worth has nothing to do with their background or bank account, and I learned that I was desperately in need of becoming a better human being. He paused, then continued with obvious difficulty. I also met someone who's been helping me understand what real compassion looks like. Maya Rodriguez. She runs the adult education program at St. Catherine's Orphanage. She's become very important to me. Emily's face lit up with recognition. Maya was like a big sister to me when I was there. She was a teenager then, but she always looked out for the younger kids. She's incredible, Richard said, his voice softening. She's taught me more about kindness and service in 6 months than I learned in my first 35 years. We're getting married next month if you'd be willing to attend. Richard Sullivan marrying an orphanage volunteer? Alexander mused. 6 months ago, I would never have believed such a transformation was possible. People can change. Dr. Hayes, you and Emily gave me that chance when you could have just as easily destroyed me. I'll spend the rest of my life proving that your faith wasn't misplaced. That evening, Emily and Alexander sat in the hospital cafeteria, where their reunion had begun 6 months earlier. Emily was now director of pediatric nursing, a position she'd accepted after Alexander insisted that she deserved recognition for her years of exceptional service. The hospital had undergone significant changes under their combined influence, becoming more focused on compassionate care and community service. I have something to tell you, Emily said, her cheeks flushing slightly. Gabriel asked me to marry him yesterday. Alexander nearly choked on his coffee. And what did you say? I said yes, but only if he was prepared for a very long engagement. I've just gotten my father back. I'm not ready to share you quite yet. Alexander reached across the table and took his daughter's hand. Sweetheart, you'll never have to share my love. It doesn't work that way. Love multiplies. It doesn't divide. Besides, Gabriel is a good man. He'll take excellent care of you. I know, it's just, I missed so many years of being your little girl. Sometimes I feel like I need to make up for lost time. We have all the time in the world now, Alexander assured her. And when you're ready to start your own family, I'll be right here, ready to be the best grandfather Chicago has ever seen. Emily squeezed his hand, her heart full of gratitude for the second chance they'd been given. Catherine had tried to destroy their family with jealousy and obsession, but love had proven stronger than hatred. As they sat together in comfortable silence, both knew that while they could never recover the 22 years that had been stolen from them, they had something even more precious, a future filled with the joy of being together, and the unshakable knowledge that nothing would ever separate them again. 2 years later, the morning sun cast golden light through the stained glass windows of St. Matthew's Cathedral, as Emily stood before the full-length mirror in the bridal suite. Adjusting the pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother, Margaret's wedding dress, carefully preserved for 24 years, fit Emily perfectly after minor alterations, making her feel connected to the woman she wished she could remember more clearly. You look exactly like your mother on her wedding day, Alexander said softly from the doorway, his voice thick with emotion. He wore a charcoal gray tuxedo and carried himself with the quiet dignity that had made him one of Chicago's most respected surgeons. But today, he was simply a father preparing to walk his daughter down the aisle. Emily turned to face him, tears of joy sparkling in her eyes. I wish she could be here. She is here, sweetheart, in your smile, in your compassion, in the way you light up every room you enter. Margaret would be so proud of the woman you've become. Alexander approached his daughter and carefully placed Margaret's sapphire tiara in her dark hair, the same tiara that had been in the Hayes family for 3 generations. This belonged to your grandmother, then your mother, and now it's yours. And someday I'll pass it to my daughter, Emily said, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. She and Gabriel had decided to wait until after the honeymoon to share their news, but the secret of her early pregnancy filled her with quiet joy. A soft knock interrupted their moment. Maya Rodriguez Sullivan peered around the door, radiant in her matron of honor dress. The photographer is ready for the father-daughter photos before the ceremony begins. Maya had married Richard 6 months earlier in a simple ceremony at St. Catherine's Orphanage, surrounded by the children who had become their extended family. The transformation in Richard continued to amaze everyone who knew him. The once arrogant businessman now spent his days building schools and clinics, driven by genuine compassion rather than tax benefits. How are you feeling? Maya asked Emily, having noticed the subtle changes that suggested early pregnancy. Perfect? Emily replied with a meaningful smile. Absolutely perfect. As the photographer captured the precious moments between father and daughter, Alexander reflected on the journey that had brought them to this day. 2 years of rebuilding their relationship, creating new memories while honoring the old ones. Emily had moved back into her childhood home, spending evenings in the garden where Alexander taught her to tend the white roses that had bloomed in her memory for over 2 decades. The healing hadn't been without challenges. Emily still occasionally suffered from nightmares about her kidnapping. Alexander struggled with guilt over the years he'd failed to find her, but they'd worked through their trauma together, with the help of family therapy. and the unshakable knowledge that their love had survived the worst that evil could inflict. In the groom's suite, Gabriel Restrepo adjusted his bow tie with hands that trembled slightly from nervous excitement. His best man, Dr. Marcus Chen, clapped him on the shoulder encouragingly. "Nervous?" Marcus asked. "Terrified," Gabriel admitted with a laugh. "Not about marrying Emily. I've never been more certain of anything in my life, but about being worthy of her, of being the husband she deserves after everything she's been through. Gabriel, you've stood by her through the most difficult period of her life. You've supported her search for identity, celebrated her reunion with her father, and helped her heal from trauma that would have broken most people. If anyone deserves Emily's love, it's you." Gabriel nodded, his confidence returning over the past 2 years. He'd become not just Emily's fiancé, but also Alexander's surrogate son, filling a void that neither man had realized existed. Their shared love for Emily had created a bond that felt as natural as blood. A knock on the door announced Richard's arrival. He entered carrying a small wrapped box, his demeanor humble but happy. "Gabriel, I wanted to give you this before the ceremony." Richard handed over the gift with a slightly nervous smile. "It's a small token of appreciation for the man who helped Emily heal." Gabriel unwrapped the box to find a vintage watch. Elegant, expensive, but clearly chosen for sentiment rather than flash. The inscription read, "To Gabriel, who proved that love conquers all, Richard Sullivan." "Richard, this is beautiful, but I can't accept something so valuable. Please, let me do this. Emily saved my soul when she forgave me, and you saved hers when you loved her. It's the least I can do." Gabriel nodded, moved by Richard's sincerity. The man who had once humiliated Emily in public was now one of her most devoted champions, proof that redemption was possible for anyone willing to change. The cathedral filled with guests from every aspect of Emily and Alexander's lives: hospital staff, former orphanage children who had become Emily's chosen family, colleagues from Gabriel's pediatric practice, and members of Chicago's medical community who had followed their story with fascination and admiration. Vincent Caruso sat in the back row, having been released from prison 6 months earlier after serving a reduced sentence for his cooperation in Catherine's prosecution. His decision to save Emily's life had earned him a measure of redemption, and both Emily and Alexander had testified on his behalf during his parole hearing. As the wedding march began, Emily appeared at the end of the aisle on Alexander's arm. The sight of his daughter in her mother's dress, glowing with happiness and love, made Alexander's heart swell with pride and gratitude. They walked slowly down the aisle, past faces filled with joy and approval. When they reached the altar, Gabriel stepped forward to take Emily's hand, but not before Alexander pulled his daughter into a fierce embrace. "I love you, my little star," he whispered in her ear. "Be happy. I love you too." "Daddy, thank you for never giving up on me." Alexander placed Emily's hand in Gabriel's with a father's blessing, then took his seat in the front pew, watching as his daughter began the next chapter of her life. The ceremony was beautiful but simple, focused on love rather than spectacle. When Gabriel and Emily exchanged vows they had written themselves, there wasn't a dry eye in the cathedral. "Emily," Gabriel said, his voice strong and clear, "you taught me that love isn't just an emotion. It's a choice we make every day. I choose you, today and always, through whatever challenges life brings us." "Gabriel," Emily replied, her voice steady despite her tears. "You loved me when I didn't even know who I was. You helped me find my family, my identity, and my strength. I choose you as my partner, my best friend, and the father of our children." Alexander's eyebrows rose at that last part, and Gabriel's face broke into a surprised grin as Emily confirmed what he'd only suspected. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, the cathedral erupted in applause and cheers. Gabriel kissed his bride with the passion of a man who had waited years for this moment, while Emily kissed back with the joy of a woman who had finally found her place in the world. 5 years later, Emily sat in the same garden where she'd played as a child, watching her 3-year-old daughter, Margaret Grace Restrepo, chase butterflies among the white roses that Alexander still tended with loving care. At 65, Alexander had semi-retired from surgery, but remained active as a consultant, spending most of his time spoiling his granddaughter and preparing for the arrival of his second grandchild. Due in 3 months, Gabriel worked nearby, building a sandbox for little Maggie, while their son kicked enthusiastically in Emily's womb. The pediatric clinic they'd opened together in Emily's old neighborhood served hundreds of families, many of them former orphans who had found hope in Emily's story. "Grandpa Alex!" Maggie called out, running to Alexander with dirt-stained hands and a gap-toothed grin that reminded everyone of her mother at the same age. "Look what I found." She held up a small butterfly that had landed on her palm, its wings iridescent in the afternoon sun. "That's a monarch butterfly, sweetheart," Alexander explained, lifting Maggie into his lap. "They travel thousands of miles to find their home." "Like Mommy did?" Maggie asked with the wisdom that only children possess. Emily felt tears prick her eyes as she watched her father and daughter together. 3 generations connected by love that had survived separation, trauma, and time itself. "Yes, darling," Emily said softly, "just like Mommy did." As the sun set over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, the Hayes Restrepo family sat together in their garden, surrounded by white roses and filled with the quiet contentment that comes from knowing that love, in the end, truly does conquer all. Catherine Hayes had died alone in prison 2 years earlier, her bitterness consuming her until the end, but her legacy of hatred had been overwhelmed by the family she had tried to destroy, proving that even the deepest wounds can heal when tended by love, forgiveness, and time. The little girl who had been lost was found. The father who had never stopped searching could finally rest, and the love that had been torn apart by evil had been made whole again, stronger than ever before. Some stories end with justice, some end with redemption, but the very best stories end with love, triumphant, and families restored, and the quiet joy of knowing that no force on earth can permanently destroy what matters most. This was one of those stories